hand. There you are. Thank you. When I was a third-year student at Harvard Law School, and sometimes in the past we've been a little bit chary about admitting where we went to law school, but now with the occupant of the White House, we're very proud to be graduate. One of the requirements is to write a third-year paper. And I had selected the course that Professor Harr taught in land use planning and wrote my third-year paper on not the most theoretically soaring subject that was available, but one that turned out to be a good grounding in what I was going to do in the next years of my life. And that was on the role that the Federal Housing Administration standards had on the development of Hialeah, Florida. It was a very pragmatic introduction to the role of government and the private sector in a very interesting and dynamic part of our state. So I want to thank Professor Harr, who is one of those heroes. A hero who is not with us today, but who we honor in this series of lectures is John DeGrove. John DeGrove was one of the people who had the greatest influence on my life. And if you don't mind, you just heard a very scholarly presentation on lessons learned. I'm going to tread some of the same ground, but I'm going to do it maybe through stories and the unique role which human beings end up playing in all of these matters. I had a wonderful colleague in the Senate for a number of years who's now deceased. He had been a sociology professor at Harvard before he became involved in politics, Daniel Patrick Moynihan. Moynihan was referred to as being the best thinker among politicians since Abraham Lincoln, and the best politician among thinkers since Thomas Jefferson. Pretty good accolades. John DeGrove had some of those same qualities. He was both a superb thinker and a superb politician, and those qualities merged as he focused on the issues of growth management in Florida. John was not a born Floridian. He was a person who, like so many others, made the decision that he wanted to be a Floridian. And with that decision, he brought a passion for our state and a desire to have it reach its full potential, which was a characteristic of his entire life, which fortunately he is still sharing with us. We have heard the history of Florida, starting with Menendez and St. Augustine in 1565. Let me just pick a few aspects of our history which I think have been particularly significant in the Florida in which we live today. First is a pattern of indifference to our state. After the Civil War, for the southern states to be returned to the Union, they had to meet certain conditions. One of those was that they had to redraw their state seal. That task in Florida fell to the then Secretary of State, who was what we Southerners call a scallywag, a person who had just come to Florida, didn't know very much about it, but under the conditions of Reconstruction, he had been able to be elected as the state Secretary of State, and he set about preparing the seal. And I will say, if you want to see the seal of the late 1860s, you can see it on the tripod that is above the main entrance to the old state capitol. It's been painted over a few times, so you have to get there when the sun is right to be able to fully appreciate it. It was a scandalous scene. It had an Indian maiden who was dropping Kumti seeds, which were a very important product of Florida in the middle of the 19th century, with a quite salacious dress, over her knees dress, provocative stance. The second thing, I guess that appealed to Reconstruction Republicans. The second is it was very unnautical. It had a steamboat, which was a major form of transportation in Florida in the middle of the 19th century, except nautical engineers had evaluated the boat, and they said it would surely have sunk as soon as it left the pier. But the most interesting thing about the seal was the fact that there was a large mountain in the background of the seal. This man just assumed, he'd never seen much of Florida, but he assumed that someplace in Florida there must be a mountain, and a mountain makes a nice backdrop for a state seal. The interesting thing about the seal, to me, was not any of those three aspects of it, but rather the fact that it continued to be the state seal into the 1970s. The fact that we continue to have as our official stamp, a stamp which was so clearly non-engineeringly supportable, was somewhat scandalous, and provided us a non-existent mountain for 100 years without anybody paying enough attention that change was made. Right? It was when Dick Stone was elected Secretary of State in 1970, at the same time RuBino was elected. He was the first Floridian who felt that it was worthwhile redoing the seal to give the Indian maiden a little bit longer dress, make the ship more salvageable, and eliminate the mountain. In 1939, Florida adopted a comprehensive legislation allowing all municipalities in Florida to engage in planning and zoning. 1939. When we did that, we were the 48th of the 48 states to have given to our municipalities the authority to engage in planning and zoning. My father was in the state Senate when that legislation passed. In 1969, when I was in the State House of Representatives, we passed a law that gave to counties the ability to plan and zone. At that point, we were the 50th of the 50 states to allow counties to zone. But by the mid-1980s, 15 years later, Florida was ranked as having the most advanced land use laws in America. How did it happen that a state that was so retarded that it left a mountain, the 48 branch cities and the 50 counties, how in 15 years did it reach such a position? Let me suggest some of the things that I think were critical. One was a cultural shift. Florida, I think the two things that have most affected Florida in its history have been hurricanes and wars. They have been turning points in the history of Florida, and World War II was certainly one of those turning points, and it created conditions that brought a lot of new people into the state, many of them from the Northeast, many of them who had some background in environmental organizations where they had come from. Many of them were quite affluent, such as the Nat Reed family, already been mentioned. And they also, a lot of them happened to be Republicans. And they brought a culture to the state, which was that this state was not a commodity to be ditched and drained and marketed, that it was a trust that each generation held, and with the responsibility of passing it on to the next generation. They started their efforts with what I call defensive environmentalism. Protecting the brown pelican was a big early success of this new group of Floridians. But by the late 60s and early 70s, they realized that they could build on their defensive victories on an affirmative, an offensive environmental program for Florida. And they brought that to the table in the early 1970s. The second thing that happened, which has already been mentioned, is the reapportionment of the legislature. And if I could tell a story, because Florida played a not well-known but very significant role in that happening. Leroy Collins had completed his 6 years as governor in January of 1961, and he moved to Washington first to be president of the National Association of Broadcasters, and later, after the Civil Rights Commission was passed by Congress, its first chair. While he was in Washington, he was attending a social occasion. I might say Governor Collins told me this story during the period between the time I had been elected governor, but before I took office, and I was trying to solicit advice from wise people, and he certainly was that. He said he was at this social occasion, and one of the other parties there was Justice Hugo Black. And Hugo Black, who had been a United States Senator from Alabama, was very disparaged when he was appointed to justice as a justice of the Supreme Court by Franklin Roosevelt because he had been in the KKK and was a very hardline segregationist. He was at the party. He asked Collins, "What was your biggest failure as governor for 6 years?" Collins said, "For 6 years, I tried to get the Florida legislature to reapportion itself and failed for 6 years." Justice Black said, "Governor Collins, you're being too hard on yourself. Let me tell you the story. 1962, there was a case called Baker versus Carr from Tennessee. It was a congressional case. Tennessee had not changed its congressional boundaries since 1900. For 60 years, they kept the same boundaries for their congressional seats, even though the population of the state had dramatically changed. In the Supreme Court, the first step is to get this court to take jurisdiction. And it takes, I think, 5 or 6 votes before the court will accept the case. I could ask my friend, Professor Hard, he could tell me exactly what that is. But they were short of that number. And the court was about to do, as it had done historically on reapportionment cases, declare this to be a political, not a justiciable case, and deny its standing. Hugo Black told the court the story of Leroy Collins and his 6 years of effort in Florida. And he said, "Gentlemen, the fact is that if we refuse to take jurisdiction of this case, we are making the decision that for the indefinite future, the people of America are going to be denied democracy in the sense that each person's vote had equal value." That example and that argument convinced enough members of the court to vote to take jurisdiction, that they heard the case, and then after having heard the case, unanimously overruled the 60-year-old Tennessee congressional reapportionment and opened the floodgates to what has happened since that time. A third thing that had happened was that some of the consequences of our past environmental actions were starting to be tangibly demonstrated. I remember this well. In the late 1960s, we had one of our periodic droughts, and much of the Everglades went dry and then caught fire. And for week after week in South Florida, from West Palm Beach to Homestead, there was this heavy smoke hanging over South Florida, and people started to ask, what in the world has gone wrong? Our paradise is now smoke invaded. And that led, after the election of RuBino and Earl M, to that